Whenever you rent or buy a video, you need to be sure that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home.
Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream. Scream for your lives.
Hail weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cup of tea. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today is here to tell us he's taking no pleasure in killing. There's just some things he's got to do. Welcome, Simon Bamford. How you doing, mate?
I'm very good, thank you, Andrew. It's interesting that your name is Andrew Graves. Do you think you were born to be doing Tea for Terror, and that this was kind of in your past? Because I've just worked with a film director called Andrew Churchyard, and I'm just beginning to think everybody seems to have very fitting names.
Yeah, it is actually my real name as well. I'm not trying to change it in some sort of crass way. It is actually my real name. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot. I kind of looked into the sort of the history of the name, and I think there's kind of two versions. One I liked the idea of apparently it's got like Eastern European connotations, and it actually one of the literal translations is Graves, meaning count or landowner, which is quite apt. I like that, but more likely my ancestors were probably grave diggers.
Grave diggers.
So probably
or,
more.
Or you were just, maybe you were just a very stern family, with very little sense of humor. It was just very grave.
Yeah, it's probably being in mind that was my dad's side. I can buy into that. It wasn't known for his sense of humor, my father. But yeah, there you go. So what have you been up to? Busy, I'd imagine.
Yes. So we've just got through Christmas. So but I'll talk more about that shortly when we get onto the film, because Christmas has a connection to the film that we're going to be talking about, as I found out yesterday. So I've been over to the States a few times. Went over to see Clive in October, November, and then did Spooky Empire show in Florida. In a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to the premiere of a film called Mosaic, which is an anthology film filmed in Southend-on-Sea, and actually premiering at Horror-on-Sea. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing that with trepidation, because I haven't seen any, apart from doing some ADR work on it, some audio work, I haven't seen any of it. So, and I always think I'm pretty shite in everything that I do. So it's always a bit of a shock, and it's even more of a shock to sit with an audience because my confidence levels usually drop enormously. But that's just me. To come to terms with that.
Find that the imposter syndrome thing, it never goes, does it? But
No.
I think I'm always slightly suspicious of people that don't have an imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
You should have an imposter syndrome. I think that's part of it. You should be kind of trepidatious about what you do, because I think that usually is quite telling that person takes what they do seriously. Whereas I think if you don't, there's confidence and then there's arrogance, and I think you can spill into arrogance with the latter, I think.
I don't think I'm arrogant.
No.
I'm quite envious of people who have that wonderful confidence where they just believe in everything they're doing, because it can be quite harsh to see yourself. It's like listening to your voice. Nobody likes listening to their voice, and seeing yourself kind of performing. All I see is me performing. I don't see what the audience is seeing. And again, once we get talking about the film that we're going to be talking about, interesting looking at the performances and the acting in that. And I was kind of relating to what they were doing. But we'll get onto that later. Anyway, so what else am I doing? So I've just signed up for a film called The Black-Eyed Children, which is
Of
shooting.
course you have.
Yeah. Yeah, when it says black, I hadn't thought about this before. It doesn't mean black-eyed as in somebody's been punching them a lot. Oh my God, can't believe I'm saying this. If they're black-eyed, is as in more of their eyes are black. They're mysterious children that come from netherworlds and are forewarnings of terrible things that are happening. So yes, so I'm doing that in 2024, which I'm looking forward to. I'm also going to Atlanta in 3 weeks for Days of the Dead. And I'm very looking forward to seeing. So I've recently become friends with Heather Lagenkamp. Is that the way you pronounce it? She was in Nightmare on Elm Street. She was the original girl, I think, in Nightmare on Elm Street. But I've just been watching The Midnight Club, and she's one of the leads in that, and been thoroughly enjoying it. So I can't wait to see her again in a few weeks and pick her brains about that and find out what it was like to work on, because I have huge respect for the writers and the direction and the cast on that. It was a great series. So did you see it?
No. I haven't seen it. So do you recommend it, do you?
Definitely. And another one I've been thoroughly enjoying is the Edgar Allan Poe Fall of the House of Usher.
Now I've just kind of dumped Netflix a few months.
Oh, have you?
Because they were just charging me ridiculous. I just wasn't watching as much as I used to on there because I'm quite into physical media. But I have heard that is top quality, top notch stuff. So hopefully, if it gets a physical release, I will buy it. But yeah, I've heard nothing but good stuff about that.
Yeah, no, it's really good. No, I'm similar actually. I'll go through. I'll drain everything I can from one media and then kind of cut that for a couple of years and go on to something else. Because otherwise you have so many subscriptions.
In fact, coincidentally, I had Nicholas Vince on the show a while back, and his chosen film was Mask of the Red Death. So you know, it's nice to know all the Cenobites to Edgar Allan Poe. So I mean, you mentioned Clive there. I'm assuming you mean Clive Barker when you met up with him.
Yes.
So I mean, obviously, you're very busy. You've got lots of stuff, lots of projects on all the time. But I guess a lot of people will know you through those kind of early Barker adaptations. So particularly with Hellraiser and Hellbound, Hellraiser II, and Nightbreed and things like that. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about that? I mean, how did you get involved with Clive in the first place?
So actually, Nick Vince and I were both at drama school together. We were in the same year at Mount View in North London. And I was doing a production of King Lear, playing the Fool in King Lear. And I was very lucky in that the director had just finished playing the Fool in King Lear for the Royal Shakespeare Company. So he was giving me a lot of tips and ideas. And he directed it as a kabuki version of King Lear. So it was very unusual. And living around the corner was a young man and his partner who just moved down from Liverpool. They had a fringe theatre company that they'd started, and that was Clive Barker. And he was performing then. He was acting and directing and writing for the dog company. And him and I think Doug Bradley and Oliver Parker all came to see this production of King Lear that I was doing at drama school and liked what I was doing. So they invited me to join the company when I graduated, which is what I did. And Clive and I have been friends for, over 40 years now, which is nice because Clive's quite a recluse these days. Doug says he's become the recluse on the hill because he lives on a hill in Beverly Hills. But as the years have gone by, he's become more and more a recluse in a room on a hill because he very rarely leaves the actual room that he's in. So when he does get out, it's rare, and he has a handful of friends that he trusts, which seems to get smaller and smaller, which is kind of sad because he's such a wonderful human being and so his brain is just mind-blowing, and his intelligence is humbling. And I never feel that I'm worthy when I go around there. But we've kept friends for all these years, and he invites me over, and I go and stay. In fact, he is going to be. I'm doing a show in Chicago in March, and he's going to be attending that one. I think he's got 5 shows coming up this year and next year, and that is like his farewell shows. That in that he's not going to be doing. Not he's planning on checking out anytime soon, but he's not planning on doing any other shows after these ones, as he wants to concentrate on his writing, of which he's prolific. When I went to see him last year, he had 6 or 7 books on the go all at once, which is just crazy. It'd be nice if he could just finish some so we could read them. I'm desperate to see Abarat. He did confide in me many years ago how he was planning on. I don't know if you've read Abarat. How he was planning on wrapping that all up, and how it was going to conclude. So that was interesting. But yeah, I love those. And Disney were interested in that at one point. They signed. Disney were very jealous of Warner Brothers having the rights for Harry Potter.
Yeah.
And were desperate to find something that could compete with that franchise, and came across Clive Barker's Abarat, which were kind of aimed at teenagers. And they signed him, and it was all very exciting. And Clive said to me at the time, he said, Clive Barker and Disney, there's 2 names we would never have put together. And he's got such an evil sense of humor. He said, I wonder how far I can push it before they dump me. And so he started kind of putting out all these pictures of erect cocks and naked men and all this stuff, and writing all this stuff, and they dumped him like a hot potato, which was such a shame, because it would have been lovely to see. Maybe it will still happen in the future, but it was lovely to see. It needs somebody like of Disney's wealth and expertise to actually create something like the whole world of Abarat and the islands of time.
I think that the problem is, I think, with something like Disney. I mean, as we've seen in more recent years, it is this, and it's not just Disney. I think it's this idea of producers and money people, and them recognizing a property that they might be able to make some money out of, and kind of the artistry is the last thing that anyone considers. It's like, it's interesting. I mentioned this before, but the new Barbie film, whatever you think about the Barbie film, it's one of the biggest hits of 2023. It was huge, but immediately, rather than producers thinking, well, what made this popular in terms of its feminist angle or the sort of satire that was inherent within it, no, which Mattel product can we market next? They missed the point, and so I'm kind of glad that Clive pushed it about as far as it could go. I think that's yeah.
You're so right. And usually the reason that most of these films are kind of suddenly appear out of nowhere as huge successes is because of the intelligence in the writing and the narrative and the storytelling, and it challenges the audience to think as well as enjoy, to be involved on an intellectual level. And that's the bit that they always completely miss. Totally. You're absolutely right. They'll go for the lowest common denominator and think, oh, this must be why it's successful. It's a shame. It's a shame there isn't a standout producer out there, and there probably is, who just won't take enormous risks, or a company. It needs a company behind a producer that lets them take risks, because it's only by taking risks that these wonderful projects get made.
I mean, it's hope. On the other side of it is, like, you got companies like A24 and things like that they do seem to be, producing things that are a bit different and strange, and particularly in terms of horror and sci-fi, you're getting some, I would, I don't want to by this. I don't want to sound like, oh, nothing good comes out, because it does. 21st Century has produced some of the best horror films ever made. Full stop. Just absolutely brilliant stuff. So I'm just talking about the big kind of companies and this kind of misinterpretation of ideas occasionally.
Yes, to be honest, thinking I'm a bit of a hypocrite anyway, because saying all of this about kind of dredging up old stuff from the past and not coming up with new ideas, and really my whole career has been on a film that was made in 1986.
But I think that says a lot, you know, something a big that I don't think that's not a negative thing, because I think that just you know, I spoke about this with Nicholas, and you know, and hopefully Barbie's going to come on at some point as well, and you know, those first two Hellraiser films, they are just incredible, and it's kind of like odd how they happened, and how, you know, Clive was able to get away with it, because I mean, they just kind of redesigned the horror film overnight. I think they are still I mean, I mean, we covered Hellbound Hellraiser 2 on episode 10, and you know, and we both kind of, it's just I think objectively possibly the first film is better, but the second film, I think I just have a massive soft spot for that film. It's just brilliant, you know. Kenneth Branagh is just incredible. Just the idea that here's Clive's idea, and we've got, you know, this guy is just basically, he's turned into a syphilitic penis. It's just amazing. Well, here we go.
Yeah, and Ken would love the idea that that's what he was playing.
And I saw an interview with him, and he was saying, you know, he only did the part because he was weighing up. He'd been offered a Shakespeare play, and then he'd been offered this film. And I think he spoke to Gary Oldman, and Gary Oldman said, "The fucking Hellraiser." But I think what swung it for him was that he saw some antique curtains he really wanted, and I think the film was paying slightly more, so he went for the antique curtain option.
I've heard that story too. I've heard that story. I love the fact that that's what you would do. I love a sweet little antique shop in Hastings or somewhere that you would do this monstrous film, flying around on this kind of strange thing that he did. I've been lucky enough to work with Ken 5 times since then on a TV series for Amazon called Dark Ditties. And he's just as wicked now as he was then. He's got a wonderful sense of humor.
Now then, Simon. So, so what was your kind of entry point into horror films? What was your earliest memories of sort of making, you know, inroads into horror?
So, I grew up in a little village in Warwickshire called Market Bosworth, which was where the Battle of Bosworth happened, and it's a tiny little place, and it had one little newsagent, and all the other boys kind of around the age of 14, 15, 16 were all kind of trying to steal the top shelf girly magazines. And I was trying to sneak out with copies of Fangoria. And so I think at that point I knew that maybe my interests were different to other people's. And I was just fascinated by the graphics. And of course, they were American magazines, and we're talking back in the 70s now. So anything American was kind of, back then, was kind of glamorous and unusual and different. And certainly for the 70s, there was nothing that compared. I used to love Mad magazine as well. So all of those American influences I found interesting at that age. And I think from then on, I found horror interesting. I remember I always looked much younger than I actually am. So the big film that everybody wanted to get in to see at the time was The Exorcist, because, like the film we're going to talk about, it was banned, which just did nothing but make it even more popular. There's nothing like forbidden fruit to get the interest stimulated. So yes, but I couldn't get into The Exorcist. In fact, I was slightly disappointed, I think, when I finally did see The Exorcist. I found it a bit slow, but I'd completely forgotten about the opening sequences in that, which were very similar to Hellraiser, actually. You can see where Clive was influenced by that with, I think they were in the desert and they were finding this artifacts in the beginning of The Exorcist. And of course, they seem to be in some kind of exotic market in the Asia for the beginning of Hellraiser. So it's very, very similar. Even the soundtrack seems quite similar. And other things, we ought to announce really other similarities that so the film we're going to be talking about is Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I watched it last night just to kind of, so I could remember it. And there are all other things that I think Clive maybe had picked up on from that. So there are a lot of things from insects, use of insects in the old house there. And there was one sequence where the girl sees something on the floor and there's this kind of scratchy, itching insect sound. And it's almost exactly the same as the sound effect that's in Hellraiser when they're looking at the table and there's these insects kind of crawling around. So interesting to see pre-Hellraiser influences on that. Anyway, I'm going away from the topic. So I wanted to see Hellraiser. So when I moved to London to go to drama school, I met Clive. Clive introduced me to private cinema clubs. I see you raising your eyebrow. Yes, various types of private cinema clubs, but the one that sticks in my mind was Scala, Scala Cinema. And I remember going there with friends, with Clive, lots of people to see. I remember I was thinking about it last night, to see Pink Flamingos. The Divine film, a film called La Maîtresse, which was a French film. It was based in France. I think it was an American film about sadomasochistic dominatrix. And one of the reasons this film was banned, because the Scala played banned films, basically you had to be a member to go and see these films, was they had a scene, they used real clients of a real dominatrix, although most of the cast were actors. And one of the scenes was this chap having his foreskin nails to a piece of wood, and it was real. It's the kind of thing once seen, never ever forgotten, and we're talking 40-50 years ago.
That's the last time you took your mum into
Oh, don't go to my parents. But thankfully they're both still with us. Yeah, I remember going with my granddad to see Hellraiser when it came out, and he was like, "Oh, very nice, yeah, lovely." So yes, and the other film that I went to see at the Scala that I can remember was Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because that was banned, and that was fascinating to see and terrified the life out of me, I have to say. And watching it last night, I didn't have a cushion, but I had my iPad out. So, because I just don't think I could kind of put myself into watching that film again, because I found it so distressing as a film, so scary and very interesting, the way that it was marketed, that it was a true story. Am I all right to talk a bit more about what I found?
Yeah.
So the rumor mill says that it was based on a true story, but from what I read last night, that was more to do with marketing. And although it was kind of, I think when he started doing some research into his premise, Tobe Hooper discovered Ed Gein and discovered took little bits from him, like he had a mask made out of human skin and he had furniture made out of human bones. But I think the interesting story, which I loved, was that Tobe Hooper came up with the idea, coming on to Christmas, which I talked about earlier. He was in a doing his Christmas shopping, and the shopping mall was absolutely packed full of people, full of the non-Christmas spirit that you get just pre-Christmas, getting angry and just trying to get things and pushing people out the way. And he saw a display of chainsaws in this Christmas shopping mall, and it just flashed through his head that one way of getting out of this hellish shopping experience would be to just go and get the chainsaws and cut his way out. Now, I think this is a lovely story. And the story goes that he went home And pretty much that night came up with the whole idea of the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, including the girl escaping twice. Ooh, spoilers. And it just, so much of it formed in his brain just from one Christmas shopping trip, which I think is fascinating and rather lovely.
So yeah, I mean, we've mentioned it a few times, but obviously, yeah, this podcast we are going to be talking about the 1974 seminal horror film, The Texas Chain Saw Massacre, directed by Tobe Hooper.
This is the movie that Rex Reed called the most horrifying motion picture I have ever seen. This film is positively ruthless in its attempt to drive you right out of your mind. It accomplishes everything it sets out to do with brilliance and unparalleled terror.
Simon, you kind of mentioned it there. So was seeing it at the Scala, was that the first time you saw it?
Yes.
Okay.
It had been banned. It was notorious when it came out in the must have been 70s, early 70s, 80s. I don't know. And there was a lot of talk of it not being allowed to ever be shown in the UK. Well, Great Britain, it was then called. And then it was allowed to be shown at these private cinema clubs, but it was the only place you could see it. And it's difficult in retrospect to see how shocking it could be, because these days we're so used to reality TV series, reality films, reality being shown as entertainment. But that didn't happen then. There was nothing like that then. So to have this thing that was saying it was a kind of a true story, which it wasn't, and then it was kind of the way it was filmed was so clever, because the performances seemed to be being improvised. A lot of the dialogue seemed very unstructured, and everything I had seen before then had very much a structured narrative, the storyline. Everything was very much controlled, and this was very loose. So it was like watching a documentary film, which for the time was bizarre. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm not sure I like this when it started. It was so interestingly enough as well. Excuse me. The disabled character, I was thinking about him. He has an interesting scene where they get to this old house and the other two couples go into the house, and suddenly you're not really aware. They're all laughing and having a good time, but the sound doesn't let you really hear what they're laughing about. And I was thinking, I see what Tobe Hooper's doing here. He's taking the disabled chap, and it's his experience. We're seeing everything through his eyes at this point, because he's being completely left out of everything that's happening. All we can hear is them giggling and having fun, and his frustration at not being able to join in and just being pushed away from this. So it was clever. It was interesting watching it again, and I have huge respect. Some of the stuff that I found out about some of the scenes and the way they all got damaged as they were filming it. And I was lucky enough. I did a few conventions in Germany back in the early 2000s, and I was lucky enough to meet Gunnar Hansen, who plays Leatherface, a few times, and we went for meals and things. And he was the gentlest, loveliest man, the most unlikely to play Leatherface.
I'm not going to dinner with Leatherface. I'm just not doing it.
He was so lovely, and it was interesting talking to him about it, and obviously telling him, what a huge fan I am of that film. And reading a little bit about him, he wasn't the first choice for Leatherface. Evidently, he was training to be an actor. I can't remember in Austin, in Texas at the time. And somebody had said to him, "Oh, you'd be brilliant for this part in this film," but the part had already been cast. And this is what I've read, so I'm hoping this is true. And but the chap who originally was cast, they found him locked in his room, completely legless, drunk, saying that there's really horrible vibes on this film and I don't want to be involved in it anymore. So he kind of pulled out, and Tobe Hooper, Gunnar went to see Tobe, who hired him on the spot to play Leatherface. But there were also really bad things. I know this is true because I remember him talking about it, Gunnar talking about it, because sadly he's no longer with us. That they got kind of terribly ripped off from pay on the film. I think it's one of the most successful horror films financially that's ever been made. I think I've read two accounts. One said it was $80,000, another said 140, but I think it made 24 million. So and is still making money. Well, it is now because I've just hired it last night, so I'm still putting money in their coffers. And the cast, because it was so low budget, they took a percentage of profit. But what they didn't know was that it wasn't from the whole profit; it was from the production company, and the production company kind of did what production companies often do when it's that kind of deal, and made sure it didn't make a profit from that side of the company. So I think the hitchhiker guy, I'm sorry, I can't remember the actors' names. I'm terrible for names. I read that 9 months on, he'd actually made $24.87, and that was only after kind of constantly hampering them for some kind of form of payment, which is shocking.
Well, I think, you mentioned the first guy that was lined up and ended up getting drunk because of the bad vibes. I think, it's great that, Gunnar ended up in that role, but I think that the first guy was right. I mean, I think, we'll get into the making of and the horror stories around that later, but I think that is what, the thing with this film is that I remember fairly clearly the first time I saw it, and I loved it. But I know I was in a room with people who were very disappointed because I think the reputation precedes it, and I think that they had kind of got it into their heads it was going to be this over-the-top splatter film where characters are going to be wading around in oceans of blood, and it's just not that film. But to me, what is the most terrifying thing about it is, like you said, it's that realism. It's the speed. If you think about when Leatherface kills, takes the bit, it's that speed. He is treating it like a slaughterhouse. He's getting his job done. That's what's the most terrifying thing. And also, it's the what you can't recapture now is that 70s gnarliness. You just it's icky again. Like we covered Black Christmas in the last episode from the same year, 1974, and that is the same thing. You want to take a shower after seeing that film, and you do definitely want to take a shower. The cast definitely wanted to take a shower after making this. We'll get into that later, but it's just you can smell this film. You can smell it. You can feel the sweat. You can feel the discomfort of the actors and the characters. It's just a nasty but brilliant film. It's one of those few films that I think it comes on the back. If you think about, if we go, okay, back in the day, you've got your Universal horrors, you've got the very gothic stuff, you've got Hammer, you've got the Edgar Allan Poe adaptations by Corman. It's all very gothic. It's great. I love that stuff. Then you get things like Les Diaboliques in 1955, followed a few years later by Psycho and things like Eyes Without a Face. This new kind of weird horror coming in, this more visceral, this more strange, this kind of more real kind of horror coming in. And then by the time you get to the end of the 60s, the Vietnam War, and you're getting people like George Romero introducing new levels of violence and horror. But then I think one of the key films, even though it's not a great film, I would argue, but it is an important film, is Last House on the Left. Now that introduces in 71, 72, this new, very uncomfortable feeling of nihilism. Before that, you'd had horror films where the villain had a reasoning behind it. And suddenly with Last House on the Left, these people were just doing something because. And that's terrifying, And this could be people down the road, literally, down the street. And so I think Texas Chain Saw Massacre is a much better film than Last House on the Left, but it's feeding into that vibe. This is why the hell is this happening? And there is, we can talk about the politics of it and it being about, arguably about, you know, broken communities, broken societies, unemployment, people being pushed to the fringes, and then city dwellers coming in as interlopers and kind of gawping at these people and getting what their comeuppance, all this kind of stuff. But in essence, there is a thread of nihilism running through this film, which is hard. You can't really top that with CG or effects. It's just a sense of something gone. In some ways, it's kind of not, it's more brutal, but it's in some ways it's a bit Lovecraftian, because it's that idea of Lovecraft repeated over and over again of, let's take a stranger and dump them into a town which has gone absolutely weird. And this is kind of very much that, and there is this kind of very, very claustrophobic sense of no escape, and nobody's coming to your help. Nobody cares. You're on your own.
In a similar way, another film that I absolutely love is Rosemary's Baby. Now, that's not nihilistic in a sense, because they are doing it for a reason. But that whole sense of paranoia, which does come out in Texas Chainsaw, because you think she's escaped, and then you realize that, oh no, there are a lot more people involved in all of this. But in Rosemary's Baby, the fact that the whole of kind of society seems to be involved in this devil worship and kind of ripping this baby out of Mia Farrow's womb. It was another film that I absolutely loved when I was growing up. Yes, interesting the way he builds up this idea, and they talk when they were in the van about the slaughterhouse. And you're absolutely right. Their very first murder is done so matter-of-factly. It is like, oh, here's just another cattle for the slaughter. Hit him over the head. Bang, bang, bang. Shut the door. Done. Dealt with. No emotion, comes out of nowhere. It's very much drawing the same parallels between what we do to animals and how close, we're just animals ourselves. We're just as vulnerable as anybody else or any other creature on the planet. And the fact that it could just happen is terrifying. It's and that's also kind of, I suppose, a kind of fear of strangers, which of course in today's society is being used so dramatically from a political point of view, and so terrifyingly. This who should we trust? Should we trust anybody? It's crazy, and it's very, I think that's even more scary actually now. The way that xenophobia is being used in society is actually scarier than Texas Chain Saw Massacre, because it's happening to the world rather than just individuals.
Okay, so I mean, we will come back to the film itself in a second, and the making of thereof and all that kind of stuff. But I'm just wondering, what's your kind of knowledge or your understanding of Tobe Hooper, and because he had a very interesting career. Obviously, he's no longer with us now, but he did a couple of features before this. This was his breakout hit, even though, as you rightly point out, he didn't really make any money from it at the time. But then he kind of went on to do various things. I mean, later on in the 80s, you've got things like Life Force, and then he did the remake of Invaders from Mars. And I think he never sort of reached the heights. I think this film and a couple of other things he's done have been brilliant, but he kind of had a weird career. And I think, there was all that kind of controversy with Poltergeist, which I would go out on a limb and say he absolutely did direct it, but because it was under the sort of production of Spielberg, he was very heavy-handed with his production at that point. Yeah. It was never going to not look like a Spielberg film. I actually think Poltergeist 2 is scarier, but I think, in terms of a film, Poltergeist still holds up, I think. But he never really...
I was really surprised yesterday when I was doing some research to see his name as director, because I just assumed that Spielberg directed Poltergeist. And then there is an IMDb that Tobe Hooper actually directed Poltergeist, and Spielberg was producing it and writing, I think, as well. But I was so surprised by that. Just in my memory of life, it doesn't feel like that was the right person to have directed it. It's funny how history plays games like that, isn't it? How memory. Sorry, I've got a strange unidentified flying object flying past my window. Sorry, I'll concentrate again. Sorry.
It's all right.
Back in the room.
If you suddenly disappear. Well, I think Poltergeist. Yeah, I do. I really like Poltergeist, but it's just because I think it's got that. Whereas, if you look at something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as mentioned earlier, it's so grainy and dirty and horrible. Whereas Poltergeist has obviously got that Spielberg veneer. It's very clean. It's kind of, I think, in some ways, even though I came into horror from different angles, I think as a kid, maybe growing up in the 80s, you could see that as being a kind of gateway. So if you think about the last scenes of sort of Indiana Jones, where people are melting away, and then you've got the scenes in this, it's almost like, you can watch Indiana Jones as a family adventure film with this horror bit at the end, and then you can go to Poltergeist, then maybe check out Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's kind of like a through road into more serious horror, I think.
Interestingly enough, I read that Tobe Hooper wanted Texas Chainsaw Massacre to be a PG film.
Oh, yeah.
And when you look at it, there's very little visual horror that is actually there. You were talking about how people were disappointed because of the hype that the film had had. And watching it, and my memory of it was that it was really graphic in its violence. But it really isn't. It's all kind of perceived. And it's just that horrible feeling of danger happening, of something about to happen. I can't think of the right word. That is so disturbing about the film. And Tobe Hooper evidently said that there were like 2 ounces of blood were actually used in the whole of the film. There was very little that was actually, and he was advised that if he wanted it to be, it was never going to be a PG rating, but if he wanted it to have a lower rating so it had a bigger audience, then he needed to limit the amount of blood, and he did. So it's very much perceived in the audience's mind. And my memory of it was, because I haven't seen it since the 1970s, was that it was very, very bloody and graphic, but actually it wasn't. But it doesn't need to be. It's interesting. It's a life lesson and stuff that the more internalized in the audience, the scarier a film can be. It doesn't have to be showing you everything. It can it's our fear.
In that sense, it's kind of like, it's much more in a kind of Hitchcockian vein. That is, with Psycho, people imagined that they saw more blood than they did because it's not actually there. And I think that in that way, it's kind of, it's not old-fashioned because it's a very new film for the time. It's a very new kind of way of doing things. But in certain ways, there is a kind of old-fashioned vibe that we don't, lack of blood doesn't mean lack of brutality. And you can't, this film is brutal. It really is brutal. And brutal's not necessarily about we see everything. The brutality comes in what we can imagine and what is going on. It's worse than what we can see. What's under the surface is even worse, because we're only shown certain parts of this. And I think when we do see the violence, one of the most horrible scenes in it is where, the girl she's just hung on a meat hook. That's just, it's, and that kind of, in some ways though, this shows you how kind of cemented these things are. In some ways, one of the first kind of horror films ever made, in inverted commas, was way back in sort of in the 19th century. This is all, in the, I think it was 1903, Bluebeard by George Milley. And it was, that has women being hung on meat hooks in that film. And so this is kind of, 70 years later or whatever, you've got this
Yeah.
film. It's kind of, it just shows you the way we were going to go. Once we've invented this technology, it's either going to go pornographic or extreme violence. That's and so I think there's a lot of stuff in there. But yeah, it's what they don't show us, and it's how did this setup happen? that's that's what's only hinted at. And then we get the dinner table scene, which is brilliant. It's funny, it's horrible, but it's funny, and it's proper American satire. This is, let's take all these kind of sitcom families we've been throwing onto your screens for years, and let's do the sickest version of that. We even got Leatherface with his lipstick on. He's the
Yeah.
mother character. We've got Grandad. Let's take that and make it the worst possible version of that.
He's married with children on acid.
Yeah.
It's yes, and that film took 27 hours to film. They did it in one epic film. In a scene, the house, evidently they had like real meat and real bones in the house, and they were filming in a heat wave, I believe. It was 100 degrees. There was no aircon, and in between takes, the cast were rushing to the windows and vomiting outside of the windows. Now, how much of that is urban legend, I don't know, but I can imagine that it was pretty grim. And Leatherface had 3 masks. So he had his murder's mask, he had his kind of his household mask, which was when he was like cleaning and just kind of tidying up, and then he had his dinner mask, as you say, which had the makeup on, because the idea of dressing for dinner, and pushing your cast those kind of extremes, filming over 27 hours. And I don't think it was planned that they were going to film over that period, but the guy who played the granddad, now, from what I read yesterday, his makeup took 10 hours, and he said he would only go through that process once. But when I watching the film, I was thinking, how can have that taken 10 hours? Because it looked like one mask that would have been put on him and maybe glued around the edges, but that no way would have that taken 10 hours to put on. It wasn't sections of latex that would be complicated to apply. So I'm sure there's a little bit of urban legend there, but I can't believe that they filmed over 27 hours just to get the stress and the anger and the frustration out of the cast. That kind of seems, and Marilyn, poor Marilyn, she's so there's the scene where they slit her finger, and evidently they had this device with a bulb with blood in it and a little fine wire, and the guy slitting the finger kept forgetting to press the bulb, and then the blood, or the false blood, was congealing in the tube, so it wasn't coming out. And they did take after take after take after this, evidently, and then they got so frustrated that the actor took the sellotape that was blunting the actual knife off the knife, so they've now got a sharp knife, and they actually cut her finger, and they did it for real. And she didn't realize until after they finished the take, I suppose because she was so kind of in the moment and probably, like everybody else, completely frustrated. So that was actually happening, and I do believe that, because I've read that on several occasions. But also when they're trying to get Grandpa to slaughter her, and he's got this hammer. Now I'm thinking, please God,
that's a brilliant scene.
Hammer, because it kept hitting her head.
Oh.
And I know it's probably a sound effect but it just looked so real. And even if it was a foam hammer, the actual kind of wooden handle, that was definitely to hitting her head. And it was hitting it again and again. And they were just the scenes that we were seeing, the takes that we were seeing. So I definitely believe that the cast were damaged, and the extreme close-ups of her eyes was so bloodshot, which kind of also goes with a 27-hour shoot. Not that I've ever, thankfully, had to do a 27-hour shoot. It kind of makes sense of her performance, especially at the end, with that absolute exhilaration and horror and everything that she's throwing into that scene when she's driving away on that truck, to get that kind of performance. And the audience is so with her at that moment. it takes pushing your cast to absolute extremes, and I think Tobe Hooper, I think, is credited with saying the cast hated him by the end of the film, and it took years for them to actually kind of forgive him. And you kind of see that, like you were saying, you can smell it. You can smell how dirty and perverse this is.
Well, it must have been rank. It must have been, we can sit here now, 50 years on, and it's 50th anniversary this year, and it's like, well, yeah. And it's kind of like, yeah, it's a brilliant film, but God, it must have been horrible for them. I mean, horrible.
100...
I mean, even if you take away the raw meat and bones that were littering this red hot old 19th century farmhouse, even in, still would have been horrible. I mean, this is early 1970s. People didn't bathe quite the way we do now. They weren't showering as much as we are. They would have been young kids, hippies or whatever, thrown into this situation. Just as the story of the film is an ordeal, the filming of this would have been an ordeal as well.
And they only had one costume. Evidently, the budget only allowed one costume, so they were wearing the same clothes for the whole shoot. Another interesting fact I found: one of the original titles for the film was Head Cheese.
Yeah.
Which is they talk about earlier in the film when they're talking about the slaughterhouse, and then that was changed to, it was going to be called Leatherface. And it wasn't until right at the last minute, the film was financed by the Texas Film Funding Board or something along those lines, and it was the guy who kind of got them the financing that came up with the kind of the getting Texas basically into the title. And so that's where the Texas Chain Saw Massacre came from, which I think is kind of an interesting detail.
It is. It's brilliant. I think, it's kind of over the top, but it's a great title because it does lend into that idea that it might be true as well. It's the kind of, it's wrought from the headlines. It's that kind of title. It's great. It's a brilliant title. And again, like the title is like a punch in the face. Before you've even started with this film, the title's a punch. You're going to see what? The Texas Chain Saw Massacre. What?
And that was the thing. So they were using a real chainsaw that was actually working. I know from wearing Butterball how little, so I couldn't see anything in the original makeup for that because there were no eye holes. In the second film, I asked them if he was going to take his glasses off, and they said no. So I made these tiny little eye holes in the makeup, but it really meant I couldn't see anything. But all that happened then was that people assume that you can see, but actually you can't because your peripheral vision is so tiny that you just cannot see very much. And that is exactly what Gunnar had as Leatherface in his mask. Was he said he couldn't see much. Plus they put him in 3-inch lifts in his shoes and then gave him a live chainsaw. He was throwing about the set. Evidently, at one take, it landed like inches away from somebody's head. I mean, again, how much of that is urban legend? I don't know, because from a sound perspective, you don't want the sound of a real chainsaw going. It was drowned so much off, although there's not much sound happening. But would you really? But then I was looking at another one, and there seemed to be smoke coming from the chainsaw.
Yeah,
and you think, okay. But again, that could have been, I don't know, 1970s. I actually believe it was a real chainsaw. I don't think.
I can imagine there were certain scenes where it was and certain scenes where it wasn't. I think the end scene where he's kind of throwing it around, I mean, that they probably would have put the sound on afterwards for that. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, the ending to this, it's kind of, it follows the kind of final girl rule, if you like, if you buy into all that stuff. But it's not, Leatherface isn't vanquished. She just gets away by the skin of her teeth, and this situation's going to carry on. This is not going.
And it leaves really a poor old lorry driver who's completely unresolved at the end of the film, who's stopped to try and help them. This poor lorry driver is like just left running away. We don't know what happens to him.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I mean, just every part of this film, I think, from the moment we've got the kids, the Scooby-Doo kids turning up in the van, and they pick up the hitchhiker who is the worst person you could possibly pick up as a hitchhiker, who is clearly mental. This is not going to end well. It's just, and then they get to the house and all this kind of stuff. Like I said, I think partly what makes this film, it's that gnarliness, it's the 70s feel, it's the heat, it's the flies buzzing round, it's the sweat, it's the blood, it's we can smell this rank situation, but it's also, the sounds, I think, from this is just, it's the thud of the doors, it's the feet on the old wooden planking floorboards. It's all of that. It's so real and so visceral. There's very few films that are able to retain that amount of power. I think from a year, we mentioned it earlier on, The Exorcist, whatever people think of The Exorcist, personally, I think that film retains just such a brilliant amount of power. It's a powerful film. But I think it's clear, The Exorcist is clearly a fantasy. It's supernatural and all this kind of stuff. Where if you rip the supernatural elements, this has none of that. This could happen, and that's what's terrifying. It's the difference between it's like the zombie film. Zombie films are really entertaining, but they kind of have this release. It's supernatural. This can't happen.
They're a roller coaster ride where you can
Yeah.
get on the roller coaster knowing you're going to be safe at the end, and just completely forget about it, but have some adrenaline running through your veins.
Yeah, but the natural extension or the upping of the ante on that is the cannibal film. You look at those cannibal films from the late 70s, early 80s, they are fucking nasty. Particularly Cannibal Holocaust. I don't, that's not for me. It's just, I don't need to see real animals being slaughtered. There's no sense of escape there. It's just nasty for the sake of nasty. But this is kind of like the halfway house. This is not, we hope nothing was really hurt during this or nobody was really hurt, but we could imagine it just looks so real that you can't shake this like you can a supernatural film, because you can imagine this happening, particularly at that time in America as well. You could imagine this happening in some sort of deserted township somewhere.
Absolutely. It's one of those things, and I think that's the reason it stays with you, is there's that you know that could happen. I mean, you're talking about hitchhikers in the 70s and 80s. I used to hitchhike all the time. Everybody hitchhiked. So it was something that we all did. I got picked up by Derek Jarman once, which is apropos of nothing, but which was picked up. Yeah, picked up. But everybody hitchhiked. But at the same time, you knew that it was dangerous. Nobody knew who was, and usually you got hit on, which is probably why it's going to be night to death. It was usually somebody older who was going to try and hit on you.
Yeah.
But
Derek Jarman probably drove around the block about 15 times, waiting. Oh, it's there.
Yeah. Oh, he's still there. Fab. Yeah, where are you going? Yes, I'm going there too.
Yeah. So, I mean, how would you? Because like I said, I think people have been disappointed when they've seen this, and I run I work at a place called Broadway Cinema, and I basically what I do is I run sort of courses, film education courses, and mostly what I do is concentrate on cult and horror. And the last course I did, I was doing, it was called American Gothic, so it's kind of looking at the history of American horror films, and obviously we covered Texas Chain Saw Massacre. So a lot of people had come and they'd seen it, or they'd watched it for the first time, or they'd previously seen it. But yeah, a lot of people were disappointed, and I was trying to kind of enthuse and try and sort of, try and contextualize it. But yeah, it remains a kind of disappointing film for some people. So obviously, it's a classic. Everybody a lot horror community absolutely jumps on this, but I think some people find it disappointing. But how would you sell it?
Reality at a time when there was no reality. I think for me that was the big selling point, and you can't return to that, because we all now live in a world of reality entertainment. So it's difficult to sell it from the point of view that I saw it when it first came out, because there was nothing like it at all at the time. But I don't know, I was surprised how well it stood up, and how much it traumatized me watching it again last night after all these years. Whether that's because I think it's like your first lovemaking, your first really being traumatized and horrified by a horror film is something that stays with you, and it's something that we are told over and over again when people come to see us at conventions, that it was the first Hellraiser or Nightbreed. They were the first films that really scared people. You get these huge truckers coming up. You get the fucking life out of me. I'm like, okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I'm really pleased. So I don't know. How would you sell it? I suppose a piece of history. I would say don't look at the hype. I think the reason that I was slightly disappointed in The Exorcist wasn't because it was a disappointing film, but because the hype on it had been so huge that you expect so much from it. And you're expecting, I was expecting as a kind of 17, 18-year-old to be very intense as a film, whereas actually watching The Exorcist back a few years ago with my nephew who'd never seen it, I was surprised how slow The Exorcist builds up, because in those days that's what you needed. These days the audiences are expecting more wham bam thank you ma'am, although I think that's changing. Now I think we're going back to a more slow build. I think the audience again like to see something a bit more intelligent. So I think things are circular.
Have you seen X?
Remind me. Probably.
Yeah, there's X, and there's Pearl as well, which is the prequel. X is very much it riffs on the same imagery of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So it's kind of like a group of people turning up. It's kind of like 70s. It's kind of, the background is that they're trying to make a porno film, and then all this kind of weird stuff happens. But there are, I'm not saying it ripping Texas Chainsaw Massacre off, but obviously the director is very much aware of that film, and it does play like an homage. It's really worth seeing. It's really eerie and strange, and there are shots in X which you can tell they have kind of tried to recreate some of those scenes from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, particularly the interior where you see the corridor and the door from inside. It's very much lots of that stuff going on. I really recommend it. It's really good. It's a really good. Like I said, it's not ripping off Texas. It's got its own thing, but it's very much aware of what's gone before and doing something through a 21st century lens. But it's got that gnarliness and that strange, grainy feel to it as well. It's great. So, Simon, have you got any plugs for us? What you up to, and is there anything you want to sell? Let us know what's happening.
Yes, I'm very bad at this, so I've got my list here, because I always forget what. So I'm going to be working on The Black-Eyed Children, which I mentioned before. I'm also I've done this 5-part series for Netflix, for Amazon Prime. I've done a 5-part series for Amazon Prime called Dark Ditties Presents, which is a horror anthology. And we are filming a kind of wraparound spoof documentary about that called Benoit, with Ken Cranham and Bruce Jones from Corrie, Mark Wingett from The Bill, and
Quadrophenia.
Quadrophenia, yes, which I was an extra in back in the day.
Were you? Yeah. Blimey. Oh man.
Yeah.
Done an episode on that. Yeah. I love Quadrophenia.
Before I went to drama school.
Were you a mod or a rocker?
I was a mod. I was 16, 17, and I probably looked about 12. So how I got the job, I've no idea. But I had an agent called Bother Boots who kind of represented young men, And yeah, he got me this extra work on Quadrophenia in the nightclub scene where he throws himself on the balcony. I've spent 2 days in this nightclub. It's supposed to be in Brighton, but it was filmed in London, listening to the same track over and over again. And my main memory, because it was all filmed, obviously it was filmed in the 80s, early 80s. I can't remember.
79.
Yeah. Was that the amount of smoke they had on this set. It was a huge set, and the smoke, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And I was thinking, how can a camera see through this? But it seems camera lenses can. Actors can't see each other, but the camera can see through it. I've seen that since in things, thinking, how does a camera see through this? Because I can't see through it anyway. But anyway, I digress again. Now my iPad switched off. What else am I doing? So I've just done a thing which was shown at the British Film Institute recently, for Cambridge University and the Globe Theatre, which was it's called A Midsummer's Nightmare, although I think I suggested that it should be called A Midsummer Night's Scream.
Works better for me.
Yeah, I think but I played Puck, Mr. Puck, and it was a kind of horror version of A Midsummer Night's Dream that the Globe commissioned. It was just a short, but it was great fun. I also filmed The Witches of the Sands, which is a kind of epic film that's been filming for 5 years. And my scene was with Lawrence Harvey from The Human Centipede. So I did a night shoot with him on that, which was fun. That will be coming out hopefully this year, but who knows. And Mosaic. And yes, so those are the things that I'm supposed to plug that I always forget that I'm supposed to do. I probably haven't sold them very well, but then I'm not very good at that bit.
Wow, fantastic. So basically you just need to if you listen to these podcasts, and people do, I'm told, so please so like and subscribe is all of that nonsense. And if you could write us a review, that would be amazing, because we like to have reviews, and it does help with distribution and all that. It just remains for me to thank my brilliant guest, Simon Bamford. I'm really genuinely thank you so much, Simon, for coming on. I know you're really busy, and it's been brilliant to talk to you. It's been brilliant to talk to another Cenobite. So thank you so much for coming on. Genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, it's been great. Thank you.
Thank you. Will you thank Arrow Media as well for all the wonderful work they've done with all the Clive Barker work? It's very much appreciated from our side. Yeah,
I do bits and bobs for Arrow. I write for Arrow quite a lot, and I was invited to. They did the when they did the re-release of the 4K, sort of the first 4 films. Yeah, I was invited to that in London, but I couldn't get, unfortunately. So I'd like to have gone to that. But yeah, Arrow. Yeah, I love Arrow. Arrow, just, regardless of the fact that I do bits and pieces of work for them, it's just a great company, and it's just brilliant. Yeah. I love the fact, we had Graham Humphreys on my second episode, and he does a lot of the artwork, the new artworks for Arrow and things like that. So yeah. I met Graham recently in Sheffield, and what a wonderful human being he is. He's drawn me a few things. Again, he did some work on the Dark did his Presents series. What a lovely man. What an absolute... He's lovely. He's great. And it's just such a pedigree as well. You talk to him, kind of tend to think of him as those kind of more newer Arrow, but then, he goes way back, and the idea, because he looks loads younger than he actually is, and the idea that he did the original sort of posters for the British release of Evil Dead. I mean, they're just classic designs, and it's amazing. His stuff. I love his stuff. He's a lovely chap. Yeah. There's some absolute gems that work in the horror industry. And when you meet them, you think how strange that all these charming, intelligent people are working in the horror industry, but there are so many of them, and they are all lovely. None of them are scary. Well, because I think that horror people get it out of their system. It's kind of there. It's we live kind of vicariously through that, and it's all coming out your system. Whereas I think people who tend to only watch EastEnders, you're just quite miserable, aren't they?
I know Clive Barker says that if he hadn't become a writer, he would definitely have been a serial killer. So I think you're correct.
No, you say no, because you're saying he's a bit of recluse and he's on his own a lot. Do we have anything to worry about, do you think?
No, he has a partner who's absolutely lovely, and he has a very scary bird called Bolingo, who's like his guard bird. Oh, it's terrifying. This bird is terrifying. Plus other birds and dogs, and no, he's surrounded by very lovely things. But I don't know why he's a recluse. I don't know. He's always been a little bit like that. Even when I first met him 40 years ago, I'll go around to see him, and he's so disciplined in his art that you would go around, you would sit there for 3 hours waiting to see him. You'd see him for 10 minutes when he had a break in his concentration, and then he'd say, right, I'm going to go back to writing now. And that's still the way. I'll go all the way to Los Angeles and I'll sit around his house for 3 days and see him for 10 minutes a day. But you respect that because you know that he's squirreling away, writing, creating, drawing. Thank goodness he does, because the stuff he comes out with is wonderful.
Yeah, I just reread Books of Blood just before Christmas, and it cannot be overstated just how brilliant they are. I mean, just absolutely gripping, just amazing. It's just rammed with ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's impossible to gauge just how talented he is. I think he's just incredible. Yes. But thank you, Simon. I really appreciate it. Yeah, if you ever fancy coming on again, if you've got another film you're desperate to talk about, let me know. Keep in touch.
Okay.
But yes.
I'll tell Barbie she needs to kind of get in touch.
Yeah, she has been in touch. I think we're gonna be doing something. But yeah. She seems game. So yeah, definitely. Oh, so remember to call round next time. Make yourself at home. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
Yes. And I have my bone china out because of Texas Chain Saw Massacre. I have been drinking out of my bone china in respect.
I've been cheating. I've had coffee.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.